Well, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here at Hughes Hall. As you can see from the screen, unfortunately, we don't have John in person. Sadly, he was recovering from COVID and so thought it best to stay away this evening. So thank you for that, John, and I hope you're feeling well enough to answer all of our questions. Just to start with an introduction from me, I'm Emily Farnworth. I'm the Director for the Centre for Climate Engagement here at Hughes Hall. We have an incredible team, some of whom are here this evening, working primarily to look at academic work on law and corporate governance and how that can drive forward change, particularly within boardrooms, legal firms around the world. And in that process, engaging our fellowship, our student base here at Hughes Hall, but more broadly across the university and actually in some cases internationally. So a warm welcome from me. Hopefully you're going to enjoy this talk, I'm sure you will. And we will save a little bit of time at the end for some questions from the audience. So firstly, John, in terms of introducing you, I think my introduction would be the guru of sustainability. You've been somebody who I've turned to for kind of reading your books and turning to you personally for advice throughout my career. But I maybe ask you a question, hand over to you. How would you describe yourself in this world?
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry not to be with you at Hughes Hall, but as Emily mentioned, I came back from Istanbul on Friday, and the following day discovered that I thought I had a head cold, then I thought I had flu. Then I tested, and to my considerable surprise, found that I had COVID. So I'm trying to shake it off, and I do have periodic lapses into coughing. So that's a public health warning in advance. Emily, to your very kind question, and it's lovely to see you. And I wish this system had robotic arms that one could sort of reach out into the room with. But how do I describe myself? I really struggle with it. I've spent 50 years now working in the what we now call the sustainability space. I've always resisted doing elevator pitches in the sense that if somebody only has 45 seconds to understand a very complex agenda, you're probably not going to get very far with them. But I suppose in a way, what I've done is to bridge between the world of business, which is where I started focusing over 45 years ago, and what was initially called environmentalism and then became sustainability and then has gone through environment, social governance, ESG, climate, all of these different things. But a lot of the work has been done at board and C-suite level.
Given that we haven't got long enough to talk about the entirety of your elevator pitch, maybe I'll also turn to the first question. Your latest book, which you very kindly sent to me, Tickling Sharks, gives an incredible overview of the wonderful kind of history that you've had, and I'm sure people will want to dive in and learn more about the details. But maybe as you recount some of the aspects that you covered in there, it would be great just to hear some of those interactions that really stick out for you, and particularly kind of on reflection of the reactions you've been getting from people from reading the book. What are some of the kind of standout moments in time that you feel that you'd really like to draw attention to with this audience?
Well, thank you. I mean, the book is my 21st, and it's the first one in which I've basically taken a memoir or autobiographical approach. And in many ways, I've done that because as I've traveled around the world, and I've worked in over 50 countries now, that people have often asked me, to start with, if I go back 40 or 50 years, older people, particularly director level people in business, would ask, what got into you that started you on this track? And by that, they meant, you've got some sort of brain virus. Where does that come? And this was a time when if you could be characterized as environmental or green, you were seen as intrinsically communist. And then I found younger people asking the question, what got into you? Where did this start? Who else was working in the field at the time? You can't have been just on your own. And so in the book, what I've tried to do is to at least sketch over the 50 years of my working life, the sorts of people who were driving this agenda, shaping it, um, uh, trying to sort of characterize some of the politics around that because it wasn't always easy. When I started off, people like Greenpeace thought that dealing with business at all was not quite a crime, but it was deeply suspect. I remember Peter Melchett in later years when he was running Greenpeace saying to me that really, as far as Greenpeace was concerned, it didn't matter that when one had conversations with business. The only way to deal with companies was to tie them down with regulations so they had no room to maneuver. And my response to Peter at the time was, I understand why you might say that, because there have been some real rogues among companies to date. But if you so constrain them that they can't move, you can't get them to be creative, innovative, do new things, or experiment with new things. So, to your question of what I'm trying to get across in the book, several things. One is that people often say, have things changed at all over the working life that I've had? And the answer, they've changed radically. They've changed quite profoundly. When I started approaching companies, you simply could not get through the front gate, let alone the front door, let alone into the boardroom. And yet, within 18 months of setting up a company in 1978 called Environmental Data Services, I found myself being asked by companies like BP and ICI, when there was an ICI, to help write their first environmental policy statement. So there was early on a certain amount of progress. But one of the things I've done, and I do in the book, is map these sort of waves, the up waves and down waves of political practices from activist groups, from the media, from government, from consumers, from financial markets, and so on. And at the moment, we see some sort of recession going on around ESG in particular, but it'll impact the sustainability field as well. And I'd love to know whether you saw any indication of that in New York with Climate Week. I mean, some people say it's just more like a plateau than a down wave. The final point is one of the things I've learned over time is that those down waves are not to be feared. They're actually really helpful because they force us to stand back a bit, take a breath, try and work out what's working and what isn't, and then come back and improve what we're doing.
Well, just a quick response. There's a big event called Climate Week in New York alongside the United Nations General Assembly, where lots of sustainability folks will gather. And maybe just to stand out, we had an event where Mike Berger from the Sabin Center at Columbia University spoke. They do a lot of work on climate litigation. And we were kind of asking the question about some of the lawyers in the US have been quite are keen to sort of give companies the advice to not get involved in collaborative efforts on climate change. You know, it's anti-competitive, that there's laws against it, so to speak. And I was it was quite good to hear the comment, there's no there. This is a non-issue. This really isn't something that, you know, people should be giving that advice on in the legal context, and it might actually slowly disappear because there just aren't going to be enough solid cases against it. So I was quite encouraged by that, and you know, that sense that, to your point, there is a little bit of a kind of stepping back from this issue. But what we heard from the US companies that we engage with is that as global institutions, they can't be held ransom for one political view in one country, depending on which way the US election goes. And so it was quite interesting to hear some of those comments. But to your point, I mean, maybe just on that point, in terms of these ups and downs, I mean, where do you feel like we need to take, a sort of a deep breath, really, in terms of other political changes that you've seen come and go, and actually this trend of sustainability keeps heading in the right direction?
One of the things that's very clear is that the ESG, sustainability agendas are being politicized. You know, right wing in particular politicians in the United States, increasingly in Europe, choose to disagree with climate science. I mean, they just think it's fiction. And so I think we're up for a fairly tough period where we have to redouble our efforts to introduce people to the science. I mean, it's amazing how few of these politicians who make these pronouncements have ever visited a climate science institute of any sort or talked even to one climate science. I mean, I've done that over 40 years now, and 20 years ago went to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution on Cape Cod, and the director took my wife Elaine, who was hoping to be with us today at Hughes Hall, and but he took us around over a full day, briefings with lots of different climate scientists, and I'd written my first report on climate back in 1978, so I thought I knew the subject. But I came out almost literally with my knees knocking in the sense that what we were being exposed to, which was genuinely shocking. And it's only now, it's in the last 6 months, that some of that material around the Atlantic currents and so on has started to come out into the mass media in the United States and in Europe. It's taking a frantically long time to get this sort of information through. So I think we've got to be more political about that. I don't say that lightly because I think one of the advantages of science is that it's apolitical, but we've got to increasingly be prepared to do the politics. And just a tiny example of what that can mean. In 2008, I set up a small change agency in London called Volants, and I'm still involved in that. And one of the projects we've recently been doing, in this case with the Unilever, is reviewing all of their trade and industry federation memberships to see to what extent the trade and industry federations of which they're a member are aligned in terms of climate policy with Unilever's declared public positions. The answer is something like a quarter. All of this is now public, but something like a quarter of those federations, associations are severely out of line. So when I talk about politics, I'm not just simply talking about chairmen and CEOs going out onto the street with protest banners. I'm talking about starting to clean up their own act. They've done it to some considerable degree around their supply chain. They've now got their interfaces with the world of government and policy and politics. And that I think is what we're beginning to see happen.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think more and more companies are recognizing that these sort of lowest common denominator industry associations are not really helpful in allowing them to grow markets in some of these new areas. In terms of the role of business, where would you look at sort of where there have been some really positive waves of change and where you still see some bad habits that exist that we need to still tackle?
Well, I think that business has changed quite remarkably over the period that I've interacted with companies and other business institutions, but not nearly fast enough. The evolutionary process has not gone nearly fast enough as yet. One of the trends, though, that you see, I see, others will see, is the appointment increasingly of chief sustainability officers. And I think that an immensely encouraging sign. I think it's quite striking. I mean, I was one of the judges on something called a grand jury of the first North American awards for chief sustainability officers, which was launched at the World Trade Center in New York this last week. And it's very striking that of the top 20 uh, chief sustainability officers listed, the overwhelming number were women, which on one hand is, I think, a very encouraging sign because women can think often rather more complex thoughts than many men, particularly in business. But it's also to me a signal that people are seeing this as a slightly second order role because otherwise perhaps rather more men would be pushed into this role. So I see that as a very intriguing. But if you ask me who in business these days do I find most interesting, I find that interesting. But it's chief economists. There are not as many of them. There are now hundreds of chief sustainability officers. There are fewer chief economists. These people have a deep sense of market trajectories, the interplay between free market regulation policy and so on. And they see stuff becoming absolutely central over time. So I'm positive, but I just think that we've got quite a challenge ahead of us. You mentioned lawyers. I think when lawyers get involved in lawyers, and look, I have lawyers in my family, or have had lawyers in the family. I had friends who are lawyers, but in the United States, they're an absolute curse. And I've worked with American multinational corporations where I've been given lectures on the sort of the in the room level as to why climate change, nothing to do with corporate governance, is no legal responsibility for companies. These people have been trained in a way that is pernicious. So every time we get a wave of compliance rather than innovation in this space, I start to worry. And with a lot of EU legislation now coming, like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is going to require thousands of years to produce annual sustainability reports. The lawyers will be crawling all over that. So if there are lawyers in the room, my apologies. Some of you will be wonderful people, and I'd love to know what you're doing. But in some ways, I see a proliferation of legal activity as a somewhat negative outcome.
No, very interesting. Thank you. One of the other things that you picked up in one of your books, Green Swans, was this sort of big disruptive activity that's gone on in the corporate world, and not singularly the corporate world, but I guess that's the sort of the place where your experience lies. What are some of the examples that you would draw out that you've sort of found fascinating at the time, and maybe any reflections on hindsight?
Well, it's interesting. Two of the magazines that I read for decades after they were launched, one was Wired and the other was Fast Company. And back in 2005, again, Elaine, my wife, and I went to Southern California to see Kevin Kelly, who was one of the early editors of Wired magazine. And he got me thinking about exponential technologies in a way that I hadn't previously properly thought about them. And then I went to see people like the X Prize Foundation in Los Angeles, and other sorts of groups who are playing into that space. And nowadays, that sort of stuff is less controversial than it then was. I just give you one instance. We did a project with the UN Global Compact, so a group of over 10,000 companies around the world, called Project Breakthrough. And we started to say that the sustainability agenda that you're seeing is this nice, comfortable, incremental agenda where you do this much this year and 10% more or 5% more next year. That is a mistake. If that's the way you're thinking about it, that's not the way that the challenges that you're trying to get your brains around are behaving. So climate change is actually exponential, whether it or not. And the opportunities aren't behaving that way either. So, for example, 2003, 4, I was working with the Ford Motor Company in Detroit or Dearborn, outside Detroit. I was working with Ford, and I had a group of 20 of his top engineers in their world headquarters. And I raised it's a bit suspect now, but I raised the question of whether they were watching what Elon Musk was doing with this new company called Tesla. And I remember very distinctly what one of those engineers told me, which is, nah, we tried electric vehicles 100 years ago, didn't work. It's not going to work again. And you look at what's happened since. And about 4 weeks ago, I was in Stuttgart with Mercedes-Benz. And companies like Mercedes and Volkswagen and so on are seeing a transformed landscape where electric vehicles, I mean, despite the problems with charging and installations and infrastructure and so on, the landscape is being transformed. So to the point where the European Commission is having to slap 50% tariffs on BYD and other Chinese manufactured electric vehicles to try and moderate their surge into the European market. So I was trying to get people to think a little bit more exponentially. It was a New York event that the Global Compact organized where I just happened to be standing some very senior business executive for North America, and I got somebody from Singularity University onto the stage. They were saying, why have we got exponential people here? What have they got to do with sustainability? Which is, in their mind, was about corporate citizenship and so on. For me, it's about convulsive, disruptive, transformative change of markets. And I think that's what we're seeing with solar, with wind, with batteries, with electric vehicles, now increasingly with artificial intelligence and so on. So I think people are beginning to get that now, but it's taken a little while to get them there.
Yeah, yeah. And I think what's interesting about this way of looking at it is we have such a challenge with the climate science, as you said before, and the planetary boundaries that are being breached and some of the negative tipping points that are going on in the natural world. But looking at some of these tipping points from a sort of new technologies that can help solve some of these challenges is something to kind of keep in mind, I guess, when we're struggling with the science.
Well, Emily, I don't know whether I can ask you a question, but one of the questions most often is, am I optimistic or pessimistic? And I tend to answer that by saying I was born an optimist. You couldn't do what I do or people like me do, believing discovery in progress. When I look at climate science at the moment, I'm spooked. I'm genuinely spooked. Tim Lenton of Exeter University, who will know, has just produced a report on tipping. And here's a positive tipping points around technology and so on. But there are also the negative tipping points. And when I think of methane and some of these sort of things, I get really seriously alarmed. Where are you on this? Because you're, in a way, even deeper into the climate debate than I am.
I think you have to have a balance of optimism, and you have to also be a realist. I mean, Christina Figueres, who led the Paris Agreement, and she has this wonderful podcast called Outrage and Optimism, and I think that's probably important to be able to hold both of those things at the same time. I guess the optimism that keeps me going is that the work that we do with non-executive directors and independent directors on corporate boards, the sort of if you like, the exponential growth in the membership of the global program that we have is quite staggering. And so whilst we've got a very, very long way to go, there are signs that there are more and more people at that sort of influential level who are starting to understand the science, starting to understand this point around it's not about incremental change as much around transforming your business offering. So I think we've still got, we do have a terrifyingly long way still to go, but at the same time there are more people at every level within the organisations pushing. And again, I guess, closer to home here at Hughes Hall in Cambridge, the student community who come from every single discipline, but wanting to understand their role as doctors, as engineers, as lawyers, so hopefully that will change eventually, as teachers, they're all interested in what their role is in this agenda. So I think that kind of, it's not just about sustainability specialists any longer, it's about permeating this topic across multiple areas of life and work. So I think I'm hopeful in that way as well.
Thank you.
Maybe that kind of leads me on that point around sort of, there's the kind of obvious power in the context of global leaders. There's the power of the sort of entrepreneurs, as you kind of termed the phrase in the context of one of your other books, and there's also that sense of soft power and the power of the youth movement. Where do you think the real power is, and where do you think we need to make sure that we're giving more power to different constituents to drive this?
It's a complicated question, and I'll try and give some sort of answer. The power often sits in money and wealth, whether we like it or not. So I've spent a lot of my time, as I explained, working with senior business leaders. I was quite shocked when about 25 years ago, I was working with the CEO of Monsanto, and he said to me, "There's a limit on what I can do because I'm only a small multinational. I'm trapped in by the legacy of the company, by government regulation. I'm trapped by competitors. I'm trapped by risk, risk multiples and return multiples on Wall Street." And he went through about 20 things that limited his capacity to do anything. But fundamentally, these people, although we may feel that they're sometimes not doing enough, in their world, they're really struggling to cope with the other wider constraints that they're having to deal with. Competitive pressures was one I didn't mention, but was top of his list in many ways. And I think over time, you see that reassert itself. So, for example, at the moment, I mentioned Mercedes-Benz. 2 weeks before I got their CEO announced publicly that he was going back on a public commitment to have 100% of Mercedes-Benz's vehicles being electric by 2030. Now, he's pushing it back 5 years. It's not forever. But within a few weeks, Unilever going back on their commitments, you had Volvo going back on their commitment, you had Ford in a very different area going back on their commitment. And what that tells you is that there is again a limit to what individual business leaders, including CFOs and CEOs, can do when they bang up against market reality, when investors and shareholders and so on will not support what they do. And the challenge is not simply do really well on climate and people forget about your financial performance. You've got to acknowledge all of these things simultaneously. And that's one of the things that has persuaded me that what we've got to do next is expand our focus from which companies are most responsible and effective in dealing with issues like and challenges like climate to the market context within which those companies operate and consider how do we over time start to change the market dynamics. And just a couple of weeks back, I went to see Helen Clarkson, who runs, as you know, the climate group. And one of their initiatives is RE100. That's now over 400 businesses, as you will know, that are committed to 100% renewable energy. And what's remarkable is that group of businesses is now, it uses electricity equivalent to France, a country the size of France. So you're starting to see things moving beyond individual companies to aggregation businesses. And I think that's very much part of the next stage.
Interesting. She actually had a gathering of a few of us who've been working on demand side sort of market mechanisms to look at kind of where those next barriers were in New York this week. And I think that one of the things that came up was the lack of focus of the Paris Agreement and the nationally determined contributions we're seeing from governments actually talking about demand side policies and the need for more focus on that. But also at the same time, the recognition that, you know, that collective action is so critical. We had someone there from the Mission Possible platform talking about green steel, for example, and so kind of getting those material demand side signals as well for green steel, cement, etc., and the role that actually governments can play in pushing their own procurement in that area. So it was an interesting topic, and I think that sort of certainly resonates for the work that we're doing. Maybe in terms of just maybe building on that sort of collective action. Are there whether it's continuing the sort of creating that demand signal or whether it's other ways, what sort of collections of people or organizations or groups have you seen sort of successful, or what would be your kind of, you know, what would you like to see, a gathering of, you know, different folks to be pushing something forward?
Well, you know, people in the room may not like this, but certainly a lot of people in business do not like it. One of the most effective, successful approaches in this entire space and that of China. And I've worked in China. Some people will know China extremely well. But if you look at areas like rare earth minerals and metals, you look at solar, you look at wind, you look at batteries, you look at electric vehicles, you look at AI, they are increasingly at the 70 to 80% and sometimes more level, controlling the commanding heights of tomorrow's economy. It's astounding how successful they've been. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not still using immense amounts of coal, which they are, because they control coal. It's a local resource, so it's not subject to embargoes or whatever it might be. But I think China has been quite remarkable And I think the US Inflation Reduction Act that Joe Biden brought in, immensely imaginative. I think we will look back on him in 20 or 30 years and see him as a much more interesting president than he's currently perceived to be in the United States. But you look at why he did it, why he was able to push it through, and particularly with Republican support to some degree, it was because of the threat from China. And so that's one area that I think we do see a form of success, but it's one that I think should concern us at times. Then I think if you look back at Greta Thunberg and the impact that one individual had, and then you look at younger climate activists, uh, the impact they've had, I think that's been immensely encouraging. But one of the things I detect, I've gone on some of the climate marches with younger people and talked to them along the way. I get the sense that younger people are not exactly losing hope, but becoming increasingly concerned about the sheer scale of what we now face, complexity, all the rest of it. And I think that's both important because it may inspire further activism and effort, but it's also quite worrying because unless leadership in government, public sector, private sector, and so on moves fairly quickly, younger people will become even more disillusioned than many of them currently are with our political systems. And I think that's deadly dangerous. It's corrosive for democracy. So I think that we see these successes. Greta, I think, was an absolute a marvel. Um, but that builds an appetite for change which, when it's not delivered, then fuels concern and disillusion and so on. So each of the examples of success I'm giving, I'm recognizing are slightly by the fact they've been second and third order challenges.
Well, I think it's the pace of change that's difficult when it takes such a long time to change. We need immediate wins these days, and it is difficult when you're trying to sort of, you know,
When you do, and in a way, you need governments that are willing and able to communicate with all people, not just voters, to explain some of those early wins. And governments aren't very good at that at the moment.
So true. In terms of, you're such a good futurist. You're so good at being able to sort of to read trends and to make predictions into the future. I don't know if you're still in the business of being able to feel confident about that. But just while we have you in this talk, it would be wonderful to hear some of your views on sort of what you're seeing or sort of indicators of where you think things might go next in this space.
Well, it's funny, but I've always been fascinated by history, but I've been fascinated by the future at the same time. And the two are, some of you will know, quite tightly interlinked. In terms of where we're going now, in the short term, it's very difficult to say exactly, except that I think we will see, unfortunately, right-wing populism, some of it increasingly effective. I think we more conflict. So, for example, I've been saying for about 7, 8 years that I think we're moving into a period of intensifying conflict. And so when the second round of the Ukraine war, some younger colleagues started to say, there's your next big conflict. I said, no, that's like the Spanish Civil War. That's where people test out their weaponry ahead of something much bigger. And as I said, I've worked in China. I've found more nationalism in the country, in Japan, where I've also worked. I don't believe China wants to go to war, but I think much of what it's doing is making a major regional conflict there really quite likely. You then look at the Middle East. I was in Jordan in October. I worked like Israel. You look at Gaza, Lebanon. It's a nightmare. So I think whether we like it or not, and I'm not going to mention Sudan, conflict is going to intensify, and that's going to push people down on traditional definitions of security. Actually, weirdly, Emily, one of the parts of society that I work with, particularly during lockdown, the success were the armed forces in the United Kingdom. So the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And what I found there, I was at one virtual event where I was speaking and surrounded by literally generals, admirals, air marshals, and so on. And they were much more thoughtful than most of the CEOs that I come across about the longer term, um, really significant security risks to, in this case, Europe, where as climate change really gets its claws into the African continent, it's not just Sudan, but you're going to get immense numbers of people being driven north. And they're thinking about that, and they're thinking about how do we deal with that, and how do we deal with that in a way that does not completely undermine current concepts of human freedom and human rights and security and the rest of it. I think we should be engaging some of these perhaps slightly less obvious communities. I'm not saying that haven't other people haven't done elements of that already, but uh, I do think, firstly, conflict. Secondly, I don't think we're done with pandemics, and I'm not saying that simply because I've had COVID for a second time. I just think the sheer number of human beings now, the frequency with which we travel across the globe, and the way in which governments, once a pandemic has started to burn out, just drop all of the preparations that they've been doing, developing during the sort of the high moments of disease is really, really worrying. So I think we're going to have to learn from some further painful shocks. Final point, and I think this is much more fundamental than anything I've said to date. In the book Tickling Sharks, what I'm basically concluding by the end of the book is that having spent 75 years on this planet alive, 50 years working professionally in the space we're talking about today, I think we're going to see more change for good and ill in the next 15 years than in the last 50. So again, I think we're at an inflection point where things are going to have to, and therefore will, change at an extraordinary pace. The question is, with the current political classes up to dealing with that in an appropriate way. My judgment is that they're not. So my judgment is that by the early 2030s, will be run by people we've never heard of or seem to be somewhat marginal. Some of those will be populists and deeply uncomfortable, but some of them will hopefully competent to deal with the new forms of reality pushed in on us. So that's in a way, I think I'm actually more optimistic now than I've been at any time over 20 years. Because when people suddenly feel that the old order is coming apart in their ears, for 2, 3 years, they try to cling on to what was, and then they start to come out of that. Back to your point about entrepreneurial activity, and you start to see entrepreneurs not just developing individual products or services or companies, starting to think, how do you reconfigure supply chains? How do you reconfigure economies? And I think that's going to be profoundly interesting.
No, that's really, really interesting. I mean, and I think I can understand those observations for sure. I think that speed of change, and that's going to force change whether we like it or not. And I guess if we've got the tools for good, then hopefully we can win over on some of these environmental issues. At this point in time, I'm going to open up to the audience so that we can take some questions.
Thank you, John, for your comments. Just a quick question. Can you comment on the American election upcoming? Your views and takes and whatever you want to say. And by the way, I'm voting for Kamala.
Kamala Harris, I don't really know her in any great depth, but what I've seen, the new version, particularly Trump, has been quite inspiring. I think this is one of the most consequential elections in my lifetime, because it's not simply what it means for the United States. It's what it means for the post-Second World War order. And if Trump were to decide he didn't like NATO and the rest of it, I think the consequences would be profound in terms of that form of security. If he also decided that he didn't like what climate scientists were saying to him, I think that's deadly. I think we've got such a narrow which to act now. I just we all had a vote in the forthcoming elections, but I wish that well it will be clear, but the Democrats I wish incredibly well. I just think it's extraordinary how in the same way as the Conservative Party in our own country, the United Kingdom, has sort of gone wrong ahead. The Republican has done the same. Again, I had family members, great friends who were Republicans. They were well traveled, they were thoughtful, they could think about bigger issues. It's not be quite the case these days. So again, I wish I were in the room discussion.
Until recently, we had a very nice young MP in our constituency, who was a superb constituency MP, very young, very educated, intelligent guy, and I liked him very much. Unfortunately, he's a climate change denier, which I cannot believe. He does not see that the climate has changed, that the weather has changed at all in the UK. He does not see that it's a problem that there's going to be more and more people wanting to migrate to this country. He thinks it's just a problem that we just need a policy on small boats. He has more time available to him now because because he lost his seat in the election. I like him. I think maybe he will be a force in the future, but I would like to convert him to being on our side. What would you suggest that I send him to read?
It's very difficult because if you go head on with these people, you confirm them in their views very often. So, for example, if the Jehovah's Witnesses come to your front door and you push back, you're simply confirming them in what they already believe. So, in tickling sharks, one of the things I'm talking about is how I've learned over a very long time to deal with, in this case, extremely powerful people who have every reason not to hear what you're saying, let alone understand for their businesses. And, it's not that they're all sharks or shark-like human beings. Very often, they're turned into that sort of creature. The very fact that they're operating within job description, incentive structures that almost give them no choice that way. So if you've got somebody who is a climate skeptic or a climate denier, it very much depends on why they are a denier. Some people are religious and they think that it doesn't really matter what we do down here on Earth. God will sort it out. It's God's will and all the rest of it. I don't see much chance of converting people like that. Others they didn't do science. They don't understand science. They feel worried about that, so they just default to saying, it's all rubbish. There's not much you can do with those people either, except over time, help them understand that there is a wider world, see if they mightn't be interested in going to see, as I said earlier on, people doing interesting work in this sort of space. But that takes time. And with an elected local official, you've not got that much time to get them sorted. So the way that we've dealt with business leaders is to try and get some of the people who are most actively involved in the change agenda to come into the particular organization. And so they actually meet these people face to face. And if they meet them face to face, it's a very much more human reaction than it was when you just point to the mutants there on the street. I remember in 1999 being in Washington, D.C., in the World Bank, on the top floor, in the boardroom, looking down at protesters, the Battle of timescale. And people were looking down at the protesters and saying, what's got into these people? They dehumanized. What they didn't realize is some of those people might be cousins or grandchildren or whatever. So you've got to break that down, bring people together. I wish there was a simple answer to your question, but I think treating them as human beings, not seeing them as completely demented, and then trying to understand where, as we say, where they're coming from, and then beginning to feel some of the countervailing information is the only way I can think about it. But some of these people get it wrong, for as long as they're in the role. They'll screw up on all of our behalves. And so the best you can do there is to call out their painful failure.
Thank you, John.
Hi there. This is a sort of related question for you, John, which is, what do you think is the best way to deal with the climate denial industry? So not the individuals you were talking about, but the massive, you referred to some of it, the sort of multi-billion-dollar industry, and some of it is transparent and it's fine and it's lobbying and we know who does it. A lot of it actually isn't, and it's really dodgy, and it gets into disinformation and manipulation on social media. And I think it's just a real challenge, because you could spend billions of pounds or dollars and hundreds of hours trying to confront it straight on, which may be a waste of our time and money. But if we don't do it, you're laying the field open to influence, to the kind of politicization of this area, which you talked about. So I'm interested to hear what you think is the best way to challenge that corporate denial industry.
Thank you. It's genuinely a great question. And for those people in the room who haven't come across personally some of this, I'll give you one example just to illustrate how it works. In the book, I talk about Stavanger, Norway, center of the fossil fuel industry in that country. I was speaking to a group, about 300 people from oil and gas companies. And I was talking about how Exxon, as part of the ExxonMobil group, had corrupted the scientific process over something like 40 years. When who should walk into the back of the room with his entourage but Rex Tillerson, who was then chairman and chief executive of ExxonMobil. And he roared from the back of the room, "That is a goddamn lie." And anyone who's come across him, he's an incredibly powerful bull-like man. And anyway, we then had this debate over 300 rather confused fossil fuel heads. And at the end, we were on a panel together and got on moderately well. 2 weeks later, New York State sued ExxonMobil for corrupting the political process around climate over 40 years. So, when the closer you get to the change, the louder people shout back at you, push back at you. So I think the pushback against change is going to intensify, which is one of the reasons why I think the pushback ESG is actually quite encouraging, although I feel ESG is flawed and redesign. So that's the first point. When it happens, and it happens, it can be quite not shocking, but it can be quite. To your question, what can we do about it? The first thing is to understand what's happening, where it's happening, to try and track the money back to the Koch brothers or whoever it is in the United States and elsewhere, to understand what the flow of money and influence is, to try and track some of the ways in which individual politicians, for example, in the United States through campaign finance, are being corrupted, and make some of that just publicly available. Doesn't mean that it will change things in its own right, but it gives people, including activists and campaigners and investors too, the sort of the grist for some of the things that they need to do. I also think at some stage we're going to have to try and make this personal. So whether we're talking about the CEO of a major company like Exxon, or we're talking about somebody who has very actively tried to uh, throw dust in the air around the climate science. At some stage, we're going to have to make this personal, and by that I mean we're going to have to make them pay, make this something that really hurts them financially. And one of the groups I really like immensely is Client Earth activist groups. And what they're doing is that they're going after some of the biggest polluters and making this hurt. And at the moment, that hasn't gone so much down to the level of individual uh, agents of corruption. But I think we've got to do that next.
Thank you for that. I think I took a note. There was a gentleman, I think, sitting next to the gentleman that just spoke, and then here and here, and then I think we'll just take those, if that's okay.
Since Paris, and maybe as we go towards the US election this year, I've noticed a lot of big corporations has walked back on their climate or other ESG commitments. But on the other hand, we also have very successful things like the Inflation Reduction Act and the upcoming, hopefully, EU carbon border adjustments, which I think are quite positive, which makes me feel like only government action to some extent and even maybe trade barriers are actually positive for climate protection or at least some kind of climate action. So do you think then like international trade or free trade is actually fundamentally incompatible then with sustained climate action? Because if you think about it, laws, politicians, political wind, whatever, will always change from country to country. So a big international corporation can't possibly comply in every single country all the time.
I think that increasingly what needs to be done will be experienced by some exporting companies as trade barriers. I mentioned the EU tariffs on electric vehicles. That's being done largely to protect the EU automotive industry. In different circumstances where free trade was the overriding value, we should have, of course, accept cheaper Chinese renewable energy technology, electric vehicle products or whatever, as sort of competitive advantage. And if they want to sink a huge amount of state funding into it, well, we should just scamper away with those sorts of things. But that's not the way we're going to go. That's not because the political consequences are too severe. Loss of jobs. So I don't think free trade is free for a very, very long time. I think it's in some ways changing now because the period of intense globalization is going very strongly in reverse. Well, that will mean all sorts of things, but among them, we'll see a growing trade barriers. Some of those will be implicit and deliberate. Some of them will be almost accidental. People are not thinking about the consequences perhaps as much as they should. But I think that this is the geopolitics of our era are now feeding into the macroeconomics of our. And one of the things that I find fascinating is a country like China trying to play both sides of the World Trade Organization. When it suits it going one way and vice versa. It's not that we don't all know the same we do, but we're at a very critical stage in the development of the next round of market economies, the next round of capitalism, and so on. Just to conclude, I don't think that if we simply lift climate change, climate solutions, all the rest of it to properly free market, we would get even within spitting distance where we need to be. I think we need very sophisticated incentive systems. That's partly political, that's partly financial. There'll be other parts of it as well that drive industries, that drive companies, that drive management teams in the right direction. And that takes you, I'm afraid, away from the totally liberal or the totally free market version of what should be. if you disagree or have other views, I'm always prepared to be convinced or seduced.
Thanks, John. I'm going to take the last two questions back to back, just to respect John's time, so he can answer them together. So there's a gentleman there, and then across here.
Do you regard the, shall we say, more populist approaches to climate change resistance, like Just Stop Oil, as helpful or a hindrance to your overall cause? Are they part of the same battle, or do you actually would you actually see them as counterproductive to persuading the wider public?
Yeah, my name is Chris Williams. Just a couple of suggestions. Number one, I think from a scientific point of view, it is very helpful to differentiate between anthropogenic climate change and natural climate change. And all too often we just hear talk of climate change, and as we know, climate has changed throughout the millennia. Second point, again, as a scientist, it worries me when any institution, particularly an international bureaucratic institution like the United Nations, claims to own the science. The last time this happened in anything like a worldly way was, I think, in the 16th century, when that well-known international institution, the Catholic Church, decided it owned the science and caused a lot of problems and delays to scientific progress. I think a bit more debate, genuine debate, would help the whole process to move along more rapidly, rather than we own the science, we don't want to hear what you've got to say.
Thank you for both questions. Let me just start by saying to the first one, I think activist groups are fundamentally important. And I've worked alongside activist groups, but I've never properly been part of them. And I think groups like Just Stop Oil could be incredibly important, as long as they don't incense ordinary people. Because once you start doing that, you start to lose your political legitimacy. And I remember there's one incident where people were clambering over a subway train and stopping people to work. It makes logical sense if you're trying to wake people up. But since people have only just woken up and wanted to go to work, it winds them up no end. And that cascades. So, and if you shut down motorways, it's very brave. But at times, I think it's very foolhardy to try some of these tactics. And I have to say, when London was shut down by young people, but not just young people, when the bridges were closed, I went and talked to the protesters outside Somerset House, which is where Valence is based. And I was very struck at the way in which these people of all ages just simply wanted to be heard. And they were absolutely non-violent. They were doing, there's a great sense of humor very often. I got 20 CEOs in business, most of them obvious usual suspects like Holland, Bennett, but to just sign a letter saying, Extinction Rebellion, don't throw the baby without the bathwater. Well, to older people and people in mainstream, pay attention to these people of whatever ages, because it's going to be significant over time. And so the first thing, I think activism is essential. I think it has to be well calibrated to the audience that you're trying to, whose views you're shift. And if you end up being as troublemaker, I don't think that helps immensely. Then to the question about climate change and the natural component, the anthropogenic component, and so on. Absolutely true. And if you go back to the Little Ice Age and previous period, humanity has grown. The climate has shifted for broadly natural reasons. It is a confirmation that it's not just us, except that You may have seen the research that has been done to show that when the Europeans went to the Americas, they killed something, the diseases that they brought in killed something like 70 to 80 million people in the Americas. What happened? The farms that these people had operated collapsed. What happened? Tree cover came in. The tree cover absorbed immense amounts of carbon dioxide in very short order. And it now increasingly looks like the European invasion of the Americas is part of what triggered then the Little Ice Age. So I'd love to continue the conversation, sir. I mean, you're obviously an expert in this space. You mentioned the Catholic Church. I mean, one of the things I think we are blind to is how our institutions themselves, including the Catholic Church, have been very resistant to the idea that nature had an equivalent role to humanity in all of this. We were given dominion over it and so on. What the recent popes have been doing, Laudato Si and so on, it's very encouraging. But it's against a long history of opposition, some of it quiet and quite effective, some of it noisy and not so effective. Your final point around gentlemanly debate, I totally agree. Gentle women and all the rest of it being wrapped into the equation as well. But I think very often debate and discussion is used as a stalling device. I think we've got to get moving, we've got to discuss as we go, not deciding when we might start to move, because this is such an urgent set of priorities. And even if part of the challenge that we face is natural, I live in London. I'm talking from a house built in 1865, where the Thames came to our front door 20 years ago, a river wall. But this house is technically underwater in about 30 years, 30, 40 years. The insurers will increasingly not touch it. I mean, they're choosing insurers. So I think this challenge is all around us. We've got to wake up, start to act. And I think that's the message you've given me for reporting back on from New York.
Yeah, wake up and start to act feels like a perfect end to this wonderful, wonderful talk. So we just thank you so much. Thanks so much.